Hi guys, my name is Lewis. We're going to study another controversial Bible passage this week. Now in looking at my last two videos, I realized that both of them were a little bit on the long side, and I felt like they were a little self-indulgent. I probably talked a little bit more than I needed to. And so my goal for this video is to keep it under 20 minutes. So root for me. Obviously, you'll know whether or not I succeeded in my goal, but hopefully I do. That's the mission, to keep this topic under 20 minutes. All right, so let's get into the topic. Now, if you're interested in the background for this passage, what I want to advise you to do is actually to go to my last video, the self-indulgent one, and watch that video, because I actually give the background for this passage in that video, and so I don't want to waste any time doing that again. Now, in terms of the passage that we're going to look at, I personally, growing up, would have never thought that this passage would be a passage that is controversial outside of the church, because the teaching in this passage was essentially the mantra for my entire youth and basically young adult years. It felt like it was the mantra of the whole country. Essentially, everybody would quote this passage as the only measurement for righteous living that was available to us, and so the idea that it's now controversial is kind of shocking to me. It's a little strange to me, and for the sake of love, I'm not going to point at the pocket of the culture for whom this is controversial, but I assume that when I start reading it, if you belong to that pocket of the culture, you'll know, because it'll start bothering you when I start reading it. All right, so let's get into it here. It's Matthew chapter 7. Read from my little pink Bible here. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, and it says, "Judge not, that you be not judged." Now, right off the get-go, let's ask the question, why? Why not judge? What if I'm righteous and you're a bad guy and you need to be judged? Why not judge? Well, let's let Jesus answer the question. "For with the judgment that you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure that you use, it will be measured to you." Now, Christians obviously are going to interpret this passage to mean that by the same measure that you judge other people, God is going to judge you, and I think that that's an accurate interpretation of that passage. But I think that we can actually interpret that phrase there to mean something else as well, which is, if you go around judging other people, you are then inviting them to judge you with the same measure that you have judged them. So with the same level of scrutiny that you're, or the same degree of scrutiny that you're applying to their lives, they're now going to apply that same level of scrutiny to your life. And the problem with that is, of course, that none of us are perfect. None of us are pure and righteous. And so maybe we might feel righteous in the moment saying that something is wrong, but do we really want the same level of scrutiny applied back to us? So let's continue here. "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your own eye,' when there's a log in your own eye?" So the point there that Jesus is making, right, is that oftentimes the person who goes around being very judgmental typically has a much bigger problem in their own life that causes them to go out into the world and be judgmental. They themselves recognize, or unconsciously, that there's something wrong with them. But the issue is they don't actually want to deal with what's wrong with them. And so it's much easier to go out and deal with what's wrong with everybody else. And because of the fact that they have the weight of this bad part of their personality pressing in on top of them, they don't, and it's too hard to get rid of that. Then again, they're going to go out and they're going to start looking for little flaws in everybody else. And essentially, probably what's happening is these people are typically fairly insecure, and so again, they're constantly like criticizing themselves. They're not actually fixing the problem. They're just criticizing themselves, and they think that that's actually a means of fixing the problem. And so then they go out into the world and they see people that are just walking around casually, minding their own business, not upset at themselves. And this person gets very frustrated about the fact that everybody else is not beating themselves up the same way that they're beating themselves up. And so they think, oh, well, these people are not righteous enough. That's why they don't beat themselves up. I need to do it for them. And the problem, as Jesus points out here, is that all that you're doing is projecting your inward problems out towards other people. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that other people do have problems, because obviously they do. Every human being is flawed, and so all of us have problems. None of us are perfectly righteous. So obviously, we could all go around doing that to each other, because all of us have problems. But the issue that Jesus says here is, if you're actually interested in fixing problems in the world, if you're actually interested in helping other people overcome the bad parts of their personality, you need to address the parts of your personality that are bad first. And so that's why he concludes by saying, you hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So the person who has actually done the hard work of fixing problems within themselves, fixing problems in their own personality, in their own sphere of influence and all of that, basically starting as locally as possible, that person will gain the experience necessary to then go out into the world and help other people who have either similar problems or maybe even different problems. Because this person has gone through the maturing experience that will then allow them to help other people. And so the issue is that when you've never fixed any problems in yourself, how are you going to fix problems in the outside world? It's theoretically much easier to fix problems within yourself, right? Because you have control over yourself. To control then the entire world and all the people around you, that in theory should be a lot more difficult than controlling yourself. You actually have control over your body, right? And so the idea there that Jesus is trying to drive home, right, is if you're going to go out into the world and criticize everyone around you, you better start by criticizing yourself, and not just criticizing, but actually recognizing what your issues are, fixing your own issues, and then once you've fixed your issues, then you can be mature enough to go out into the world and hopefully fix other people's problems. Now, there's one other thing that I want to touch on in terms of this subject, which is a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where essentially the background leading into this is that Paul is writing this letter to a church in Corinth. Obviously, that's where the book gets its name, and in the letter, he's essentially giving advice to the church as to what they're supposed to do with this one gentleman who is apparently committing sexual immorality. That he's essentially in the midst of a very egregiously sinful relationship where he's in his father has either died or is out of the picture in some way, and so now he has married his stepmom, and Paul considers this to be extremely egregious, and so he's giving advice to the church as to what they should do about this situation. And he actually tells them, you shouldn't associate with this man anymore, so that way he recognizes that he's out of fellowship with the church. He'll recognize his own sin, and then, he'll stop doing it. That's essentially the intention, right? And so he writes this to the church as he's giving them this advice. He says, "For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those on the outside. Now purge the evil person from among you." And so I wanted to close with this because, as I always do, I like to close by talking directly to the Christians and telling them that the standard to which they hold themselves should be much higher than the standard to which they hold the outside world. And actually, the reason I do that is because of this specific passage here. Paul says that the outside world is the world outside of the church is filled with all kinds of ideas, all kinds of behaviors, and all that kind of stuff that Christians don't agree with and should not be participating in. However, Paul says, my concern is not those people. Those people are the concern of God, who is their maker. God loves them, and he has every intention of trying to rescue them from whatever it is that God considers to be wrong, the wrong aspects of their behavior. God is intending to rescue them from that. But that's not your concern. That's God's concern. Your concern is with other Christians, because other Christians have made the commitment to follow the teachings of Jesus. And as a community, we're intended to hold each other accountable to those teachings. And so when Christians go out into the world and judge the world, they're, number one, blatantly disobeying what Paul says here, and they're also disobeying what Jesus says, which is not good. But two, they're kind of, again, they're inviting the scrutiny of the world upon themselves. And you definitely don't want to invite the scrutiny of the world upon yourself if you're not ready to receive that level of scrutiny. If your life is not, being lived in a way that is open to scrutiny, and in terms of Christians going out and judging the rest of the world, that's not your concern. Your concern is not what the world is doing. Your concern should be with, number one, what you're doing, how you're living your life, and then number two, how are your brothers and sisters doing? And the reason that Paul tells the Corinthian church to judge is not, just flippantly telling them like, oh yeah, get on your high horse and feel self-righteous and kick this guy out of the church. The whole idea behind it is, hey, help this guy recognize that even though he's a Christian and he's taken on the name of Christian and he's accepted the idea that he has to abide by Christ's teachings, he's not. And so you need to make him aware of that by this kind of radical action. And then once he's aware of that, the idea is, restore him, bring him back into the church, forgive him. That's the whole point. Is always to be is ultimately to redeem the person. And that's really what's at the heart of this teaching of Jesus, is that we're not supposed to judge. The idea is all of us are worthy of judgment. That's the bottom line. All of us are worthy of judgment. All of us are doing things that are detrimental to the world, that are detrimental to our neighbors, and that are detrimental to ourselves. And God, who has the right to judge us, has actually had mercy on us. And so that level of mercy that God has had on you, you should now have on others. And that mercy will actually be much more redemptive and much more helpful in terms of bringing others to a better place, to a place of salvation from those bad deeds. And I use that term, not just how Christians use the term of salvation, like where we get to go to heaven. I mean, if you think that a person is doing something wrong and you want to rescue them from that thing that they're doing wrong, that's a salvation, right? Like if you have a friend that's completely given into alcoholism or drugs or something like that, and you want to help them to stop, you're saving them from that act, right? And so if you really want to do that, you have to start at a place of mercy, not at a place of judgment. Because if you start at a place of judgment, you're really never going to help them. And more than likely, you're actually turning yourself into a worse person while simultaneously not helping the person that you think you're trying to help. I hope that made sense. And look, I met my goal. I kept it under 20 minutes. So for all of you who listened, I love you all very much. Have a good day.